This week on the Lady Brain Show, Dr. Eric Gimon. He's a physicist with energy innovation, and he's here to talk about climate change. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you.
It's great to be here with you. Recently, Bill Nye, the science guy, was on a panel on CNN. It was supposed to be a fair discussion about climate change. And at the last minute, they threw in a climate denier. And Bill was very, very upset about it. What do you have to say to that?
Well, look, I think that's completely understandable. I mean, from his point of view, this is a debate that's way past its prime. There's no real reason to doubt a lot of the evidence for climate change or why climate change is happening. And the press has really played this out because there's a easy kind of tension dynamic you can keep going that it gives you story, it gives you tension, and so it draws in viewers. It's a lot less fun if you just have one side, even if there isn't really much to think about on the other side. The thing about climate change is you don't need to be a climate scientist to understand it. And so that's a real cop-out when you hear some politicians say, I'm not a climate scientist. It's very simple physics at the core of it, okay? The planet normally would be a frozen ball of ice, but we have an atmosphere, and the atmosphere captures heat on the way out. Now, there's two kinds of ways you think about heat. There's heat that is transferred to your finger when you put it in boiling water like that. That's things touching each other. Okay, we don't touch space. Space is basically empty. And then there's heat that's sent out as radiation, something hot, think about just really hot iron that's like glowing white. That's really, really hot, and you see the heat. But things that are less hot, there's stuff coming out, there's light coming out, but it's in the infrared. Okay, so the blanket around the planet basically blocks that infrared from coming out, keeps the heat in, and that's why we have the livable planet we're on. But that's a blanket that's adjustable depending on the levels of greenhouse gases. And so if you increase the greenhouse gases, the blanket is stronger and you're going to get hotter over time. And it's very easy to see that's happening. You can even look at the planet from space. From space, it looks cooler because as the blanket's blocking the infrared from coming out. So, but the big problem with climate change is you have this whole sequence of things. You burn stuff already. Then you go out and you find more mines, more stuff to burn. Okay, so we got to stop increasing the amount of stuff we burn. Then we've got to stop burning stuff because burning stuff puts greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That makes the blanket thicker. Okay. You make the blanket thicker, it slowly heats up the planet. Okay. So it slowly heats up the planet over hundreds of years, but it's already having effects now. Okay. With the size blanket we've got now already, we're going to have huge temperature increases in the next few hundred years, and a lot of increase already by the end of this century. And then what that means is you capture, one of the main effects of that is you capture more water in the atmosphere. And so you can get more rain in some places, and you can suck humidity out of other places, so you get more drought in other places. So you get this pattern back and forth. And that dynamic of you burn stuff, it makes the blanket bigger, it prevents light from infrared from coming out, is pretty simple physics. Now there's things that modify that, like the ice cap or like clouds and things like that. But it's basically people arguing about I've got a car crash and I'm going to hit the wall, and one person's going to say, well, is the door going to crumple that way or that way? Is the guy's head the dummy's head going to get chopped off or just bruised? I mean, at some level we don't really care. This is a slow-moving disaster.
Right.
And so it's very tiresome when you've been trying to push this message to constantly have these kind of deniers brought out that are basically a way for incumbent interests to protect what they have.
To protect what they have, in that conversation that Bill Nye had on CNN, he said science is political. And you can't help but agree when you see the opposing political parties, some where the climate deniers are sitting saying, no, it's not a problem, and the others saying, yes, it is a problem. But one point that he had was, internationally, people are going to look at the United States and say, we're behind the curve, and eventually people aren't going to want to do business with us. And so that was something as well. Now, I would think that the people who are denying are the ones that want the money and the big business, but they can't see past the immediate situation that we're in. So I guess my question is this. How soon is this dangerous? You said by the end of the century, the temperatures are going to increase. What about when our kids are grown? I mean, how severe would it be if we just kept doing what we're doing and made no effort to stop it
anything
in its
about it?
tracks?
We don't know exactly, but awful is the general answer. I mean, I think a lot. I mean, I have kids the same age as yours. I think about them, and I think about, 2050, I'll be 80. I'll be, I'm happy to be alive by then. Is one of the kind of key dates that people talk about in terms of like the major efforts happening or not happening. By 2050, if we don't do much, we're going to see major effects. We're going to see people exiting Bangladesh or huge, we got 3 famines going on in Africa right now that we've never had 3 at the same time, right? Sometimes that's political and sometimes that's the drought and sometimes it's both. We got the war in Syria. You would just want to see all that stuff on steroids. That's what our kids are going to experience. And on top of that, there's lots of other stuff that they have to experience. The population of the planet's increasing. The resources we have for agriculture are diminishing. So, they are going to see a really different world than us no matter what. And I think our role is to try to mitigate some of the potential downsides, some of the potential bad things that they're going to see. And then, so there's always something you can do. You can always make it a little bit better. It's not like we're trying to hit a mark, like an actor on a stage. Okay? If we don't hit 400, then we should try not hit 450. If we don't hit 450, we should try not hit 500. But already we're headed in a pretty bad direction, I would say.
Can it be? I've heard conflicting reports. If we continue to do the things that we're doing now with alternative energy and reducing CO2 emissions and all that kind of stuff, if we continue to do that, can we reverse climate change? I've heard that we can.
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean. Some things are already in play. Like we're seeing ice melting a lot faster off the glaciers and so on. And so some of these things, you can't rewind the tape that easily, right? Like once you've lost it's like the bathtub. Once you pull out the plug and the water's coming out, it's a lot harder to get the water to come back up.
Right.
Some other things like, the levels in the atmosphere of 450 or whatever parts per million, you can bring those levels back down, okay? So you don't have to feel the effects for as long. You don't have to make the blanket thick for as long, right? So you don't build up as much heat for as long. So there's definitely things we can do by not making things worse, which is really the job for the next 80 years. After that, there are technologies called carbon capture technologies. So with carbon capture technology, at first you could try to get CO2 out of like industrial processes and so on. And then eventually you could try to pull it out of the air. And that would mitigate some of the problem. But that's, it's hard to talk about solutions to removing CO2 when we're busily digging the hole deeper right now.
Right.
But it is one of the things that people who have a long-term view on the problem really think about a lot.
Okay. I want you to hold that thought. We're going to take a break and we'll be right back with Dr. Eric Gimon. We're back with Dr. Eric Gimon talking about climate change. Eric, before we broke, you were mentioning that we, as Americans, are digging a hole on a daily basis. We're digging ourselves deeper and deeper into the problem zone, for lack of a better word. We in California experienced a drought that lasted years. But this last winter was one of our wettest in years. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So the main drought, I think you remember the ridge that wouldn't go away, or the polar vortex or whatever. We basically had instabilities. I'm not an expert on this stuff. I'm just giving you what an informed scientist type could say. But basically had these instabilities in the dynamics around the North Pole. And that's because the North Pole is warming up faster than anywhere else, like 3 or 4 times faster, okay? And so there's smaller temperature gradients, and that's making some of these weather systems different than they used to be. And so what that did here was create a low or high, pressure system that wouldn't go away, and so it was basically shooing storms off of California.
Okay.
Right. In this year, what we've had is what I think people call an atmospheric river. You get these kind of currents in the atmosphere where just one storm after another just keeps heading here from like generally Hawaii and so on. Now, that's also something you would expect with climate change because you're putting more moisture in the water. Do you know why it feels so dry when you're in a cabin in the wintertime at altitude? It's because cold air doesn't hold as much water. So when you take cold air and you warm it up to be like warm temperature in your house, it feels like it's missing water in it and it feels dry. It's the same thing. If you heat up air, it can take more water into it. So more moisture in the air makes bigger storm systems, makes these atmospheric rivers more likely. In general, what a lot of these people who study climate systems think is that we've had a remarkably stable run of 10,000 years, and that in general, the planet's not quite that stable in terms of climate systems. And so as we move out of the zone that we're familiar with, we could see a lot more instability. So that means both drought and flood. It's great.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so as Californians, we're fairly close to the coastline. What does that mean for us? I mean, I've seen the view of, I went to school in Malibu. Yeah. And I remember seeing, here's what Malibu looked like in the 70s. And then I saw a picture of that same coastline from my university, what it looked like, just a couple of years ago. And it's like, we're falling into the ocean, or the ocean's coming up and taking over.
Yeah, I think about that. I live in the hills in Berkeley, so I can kind of see all the way to the water. And sometimes I think, like, where does it stop? Where's the 3 foot, 2, 3, line, and so on. It's hard to do that, like, in your mind. But there's groups like the Pacific Institute out of Oakland. They did a study just a few years ago where they showed the impact on California infrastructure of different levels of sea level rise. And you basically, around here in the Bay Area, you would lose all the airports, with a fairly low level of sea level rise. It's a pretty big impact on all the infrastructure. And there was even a judge down in Ventura that rejected a permit or something because they hadn't thought about sea level rise consequences for the future of the infrastructure project they were looking at.
How soon is that going to happen?
Well, that's, how I was telling you about the car crash? We don't really know exactly how the car crashes. So one of the big uncertainties is how do the glaciers in Antarctica and in Greenland react to the changes in the climate. So how quick, the ice that's floating on the water, that's not a problem because the way ice and water work together, you never change the level of the glass when the ice melts. But the ice that's on land, sitting on land, when it melts, it raises. So you get basically 3 main effects. The ocean expands thermally because anything that gets hotter expands. Mm-hmm. And you get a little bit of sea level rise, and that you can kind of understand pretty well. But these glaciers, you can get out of Greenland, 20 feet or something like that, another 60 feet out of Antarctica or something like that. And that when that happens, we don't know.
Right.
All I can tell you is it's been happening a lot faster than people expected. Mm-hmm. And this year, for example, the number of little icebergs floating around is 10 or 50 times what it was last year or something like that.
Scary. So we need to stop that in its tracks.
Right.
And then we can keep our airports and stay on dry land.
I mean, at some level, we're going to have to manage some change. Some change is already baked in, and we're going to have to manage it. It's not happening overnight, so what we need is thoughtful planning, where you take science into account to understand what's coming down the pike, and you don't try to kind of stick your head in the sand and, ignore the doctor who's telling you you've got cancer.
Right. Treat it.
Yeah,
Let's
exactly.
treat it.
Let's treat it.
Okay. So my husband is an environmental attorney, and he works on permitting renewable energy projects. And he mentioned something to me called the duck curve. And it's really, it's fascinating. I'd love it if you could kind of dumb it down for me and explain what it is.
So, I started out in physics before I got into to policy, energy policy, and so on. So I understood how electricity works and resistors and all that stuff. I took the basic classes. But I never thought much about where the power comes from in my socket. I just plug things in, and here it is.
There it is.
There it is. And so people tend to think electricity is just like a commodity. You plug in when you need it, and at the end of the month, you get a bill and a certain number of kilowatt hours, right? And so then when I tell you I want to make those kilowatt hours cleaner, that's pretty simple. I'm going to stop getting them from this, and I'm going to get them from that. The thing is, people go through this evolution. People who have to worry about making the grid work, they go through this evolution. It's great, we'll make things clean. And then the next big insight they have is, oh no, the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. The whole system's going to go to crap.
Yeah.
But the thing is, power plants break down all the time. Whole nuclear plants have to be refueled for 2 weeks or whatever. Our power system is used to variation. Or they can be a big soccer match one day and everybody like turns on their tea kettle at the same time, and that happened in England.
Okay.
You know, so we're used to dealing with these systems. It's not like this is like a new thing to have to deal with variability, but it is a new kind of challenge. And so we need to adapt the institutions that manage our electricity grid. Now, one of the biggest challenges that's happening right now in California is the so-called duck curve. Mm-hmm. The cheapest new renewable power you can get today in California is solar. It's really easy to build. We get lots of sun. It's gotten cheaper and cheaper. It's like dropped 80%
right.
since my first child was born. And so solar comes when the sun is up. It's a pretty simple
daylight
thing.
Hours.
So it comes in at daylight hours. So now we get a huge hunk of solar in the middle of the day. No, the system wasn't used to that. It used to be in the middle of the day, you were kind of had some plants running and they kind of ran through most of the day. And now there's some plants that need to run in the morning, stop running in the middle of the day, and then run again in the evening. And they're not set up for that. Some of them, they're not set up for that technically. Some of that are just, they're not set up for that in terms of contracts and structures and so on. Because some of that power we get from the Northwest or from Utah or some other places. And so what you're seeing is because we've had these really ambitious targets in California, we've added a lot of power. We've added a lot of power to the system that comes from solar, and it's coming in the middle of the day. And so it's depressing prices in the middle of the day. And it's lowering demand in the middle of the day for the other kinds of power plants that aren't quite used to it. And it's happening pretty fast. So like in the spring and winter, the kind of peak load for California is about 26 gigawatts. Don't worry about the units too much. And we have a slug of maybe 8 gigawatts of solar coming into that, on top of rooftop systems that people have. And so at the middle of the day, it's down to like 10. Mm-hmm. And so you got like a nuclear plant that's at 3, and you got some hydro, and you got some imports, and then you got your thermal fleet, and then you have to manage kind of getting back up. So suddenly everybody's kind of worrying about this, and they call it the duck curve because it's high at the beginning, and low at the bottom, and then back up, and it used to be flat. So when you put those two lines together, it looks kind of like a duck. I mean, honestly speaking, this is an important challenge for the grid today. It's not a long-term challenge for the grid. This is a problem that's really well suited to be managed by things like batteries or what's called demand response, shifting your load, preheating buildings. There's all kinds of things. We just haven't had to do them before. And so all the structures for making them happen aren't there. And that's hard work. And that's where people like me get involved.
And you help you implement it or help people figure out how to implement it through.
Yeah.
And incorporate it into the grid.
What I try to do is play a role where I'm translating some of the kind of technical stuff for people who don't quite necessarily get the technical stuff. And that is important for decision makers because they come from all walks of life. They don't come with a PhD in physics.
Right.
And then it's also important because a lot of the expertise is in what we call the kind of priesthood, like the few people who worried about this for the last 20 or 30 years. And they have their own incentives and agenda. Right? I mean, some of them are just people who've done it this way for a while and they don't want to change. And some of them are associated with the companies that were burning fossil fuels, so they definitely don't want things to change. And they have a way of explaining this is how it is. And so there's a gap in the public discussion where you don't have kind of people with expertise who don't necessarily have ties to the way things used to be done.
Okay, so you're helping to fill that gap.
Exactly.
We're going to break. There's more, and we will be right back with Dr. Eric Gimon. We're back with Dr. Eric Gimon talking about climate change. Eric, can you tell me what the Paris Climate Agreement is?
Sure. So ever since we've known about climate as a problem, there's been kind of a series of negotiations. But there was always this sense that it would be something expensive to do something about, that most of the problem had been caused by kind of developed countries and not developing countries. And so that created a set of agreements, mostly referred to as the Kyoto Treaty, that was being negotiated during the Clinton administration, and then the Bush administration pulled out, or basically never asked to have that ratified. But But there was always this sense of, well, China's not in on the deal, and it's this kind of first mover, tragedy of the commons kind of thing. So what was really exciting last year in Paris is that UN kind of moderated process brought together countries from all over the world to agree on a target for where, what we're trying to limit temperature rises to, and also to agree on a process for showing what they were doing. So to like meet up every few years and compare notes and so on. It doesn't have a lot of enforcement value, but it's hard to understand exactly who would be the enforcer in an international agreement. But the other thing is it brought in China as a partner with the US, and a lot of these countries understanding that actually moving to a renewable future, to a cleaner future, is good for them. It's a better path for them. China has these kind of insane air pollution events, the same in India and so on. So there's that element of it. And also these solutions are getting cheaper. Now, the goal that they set was 2 degrees. And then there was another goal of 1.5 degree that kind of got brought in at the last minute. Now, for those of us who work on like how to get to 2 degrees by the end of, how not to get over 2 degrees by the end of the century, that is a very ambitious target. I mean, we need to start, remember how I started talking about carbon removal technology?
Yes.
We need some of that to start kicking in by like 2070. And we need to be on a very aggressive path to reduce first electricity, then transportation, then industry, and then agriculture and other things. So, already 2 degrees sun, and then people are talking about 1.5 degrees. So I asked one of these, diplomats, like, why are you pushing for 1.5? Like, nobody thinks this is possible. And what the person told me was, look, I come from a country that if we go over 1.5, my country is gone. For me, anything over 1.5 is genocide.
It's life or death.
I'm not going to sign an agreement where I've agreed that 2 is okay.
Because 2 means we're done.
Because 2 means, for my people, means we're done.
Wow.
And that was really powerful. And I still don't know how to kind of deal with that tension in my mind. The pragmatic side of me is like, it's going to be hard to hit 2. I'll be happy if we hit 2. And then that same side knows that even at 2, there's going to be impact on some people, a lot of people. So having an administration today that is full of climate deniers and incompetence is not really helping things. But this was a milestone. It's got a process.
Yeah.
All the other countries are very committed to it. So whether we participate or not, a lot of our energy policy is done at the state level here.
Yay.
So that means that it's less dependent on what's going on in Washington. So Washington creates kind of a headwind or a wind at your back, depending on the situation, but it's not the full story. And even like utility executives have to think, they have to make investment decisions for 20 years. So do they know if this guy's going to be here for 4 or 8 years? Like, if they make the wrong move, if they start like authorizing more improvements on coal plants or whatever, they could lose a lot of money down the line.
Well, thank you so much. You have been, you have really opened my eyes to some new stuff, and I'm committed now more than ever, and I really appreciate you being here today.
Well, sure, anytime.
Thanks, Eric.